Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be working on menus and getting some transitions in, as well as a basic pause menu and some restart functionality for when the player dies. So go ahead and grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea and let's get started. So first off, let's go over some changes in the scenes. The first change being the level camera. So much like most games, we do want to go ahead and have a camera that it defaults to when we're on the main screen, and we're just going to hide the player and make the world pause whenever we do this, and then we'll transition to the player camera afterwards. And that's this level camera right here. If we unpreview it, you can see it's up kind of in the corner and it's just pointed at the world. And I found this was a pretty good nondescript location to put the camera. Now, in addition to this, I went ahead and made a prefab for the menus. In here, you'll find all sorts of menus with various buttons depending on them. So we have the first launch menu, and you just have a couple options here with a full screen toggle, which we'll be hooking up and explaining later, as well as a play and quit button, and then generally what you would expect from the other menus. You got pause menu and a restart menu. Now, in addition to this, we went ahead and added a canvas layer for the transition overlay. Now, the canvas layer is set to layer 2. If you go over to the player body and see the damage overlay, you'll see that set to layer 1. We did this so that the damage red overlay, like the pulsing veins, will be obscured by the actual transition of the level. So the transition overlay is right here, and it's pretty much exactly the same. It's just a different color and texture, and you can see it fades out to a kind of bluish color. Now, in order to begin, we'll go ahead and create a script called menu handler. Let's throw that in the player folder under code, and we'll open it and get started. So let's go ahead and delete this process function. We're going to go ahead and create a bunch of helper scripts that are just going to be referenced by the various buttons. So we'll need restart, quit, change level, play, pause, things like that. So we're going to create a bunch of just generalized helper scripts. We're going to be starting this with the transition, however. But before we can start with that, we do need to go ahead and make our exports. So let's create up at the top 3 exports for the launch, pause menu, and death menu. And that's just these controls right here. Now, just below that, we can go ahead and add a reference to the player node, the level camera, and the transition material. Now, the player node and the level camera are actually going to be referenced in the level scene, and then the transition material is just going to be the material in the materials folder underneath player, and that's going to be the menu overlay material right there. Just below that, we do need 2 more variables. The first one's going to be an export of type float, and it's going to be the transition time between fading out to black and fading back from black to clear. And then we're also going to have a Boolean for if we're currently playing. And if we're not currently playing, we don't need to allow the pause menu functionality. That's pretty much it. It's just going to handle when you're first on the launch screen and when you're dead. Now, starting with the transitions all the way down to the bottom, let's go ahead and create a new script called set transition value. It's just going to take a float value and it's going to set the transition material shader parameter effect strength to the new value. And this is exactly like we did with the damage overlay. And that's just going to fade in or fade out depending on whatever that new value is. Now, the reason why we put this in a function is we're going to be using tweens to transition from one value to another. And tweens are kind of a complex subject. I'll leave a link to the documentation in the description. But in essence, they can't directly interact with this material. So we're going to need a function to be called. And this function on every frame of the tween will be called with a value that is blending from either 3 to 0 or 0 to 3 over the transition time. So let's go ahead and create that function. We're going to be calling this one tween in transition. And this is just going to blend in that transition overlay. Now, we're passing a variable here called completion callable, and we're defaulting it to null. This completion callable is going to later be of type callable, but we do need it to be nullable. So we're not going to define the type, and instead we're going to check it later. And all that completion callable is a function that we need to call when the transition is complete. And the reason why we're nulling it is so that this tween in transition function can be called with no variables. So you can either call it with a function that you want to call afterwards, or you can just call it normally and let it go ahead and transition without calling any function afterwards. So let's go ahead and create the tween. We're going to be using the getTree.createTween function, and then it'll return an object of type tween. And then we're going to go ahead and set the pause mode to tween pause process. This just means that no matter what, even if the game is paused, the tween will still be executing. Then we're going to go ahead and call the tween method function, and we're going to be passing it the set transition value.bind. And all that's going to do is convert that function into a callable object, and then we're going to be calling that every frame using the transition time to blend between 0 and 3. And last but not least, we just need to check to see if the completion callable does not equal null and the completion callable is of type callable, then go ahead and add that as a tween callback. So that just means that whenever we fully transition, we'll execute whatever function we've been passed. Now, in addition to this tween in transition, we do need a tween out transition. That's going to be fading from black back to clear, back to play mode. And we're just going to be doing the exact same function as down here. The only difference being instead of 0 to 3, we're going to be using 3 to 0. Just above this, we can go ahead and create a function for exit game. And that's going to be doing a tween in transition. So it's going to be fading to black. And we're going to be passing in a callable that is referencing the quit function of the tree. And we just do that by saying get tree.quit bind, and that creates a callable object so the transition executes, and whenever it's done executing, it goes ahead and quits out of the game. And we can go ahead and create a restart function, and this is just going to be reloading the current scene, and then it'll be on the restart menu. And we can go ahead and get started with a couple of the menus. First off, let's handle the pause menu. So whenever the pause menu function is called, we need to set the mouse to visible. We need to set the pause menu, that's this control right up here, to visible, as well as setting the getTree.pause boolean to true. And this is going to go ahead and kill all of the movement in the game. It's going to stop time, and then we'll unpause it when we disable the pause menu. So speaking of which, let's go ahead and create the hide pause menu function, and that's going to be pretty much the exact opposite of this function up here. We're going to be capturing the mouse, unpausing the game, and hiding the pause menu. And just below this, let's go ahead and handle the launch functions. So the launch function is going to be called whenever you press the play button on the launch menu, and it's going to be first off capturing the mouse. So it's going to go ahead and make the mouse invisible, and it's going to make the launch menu visible equal false. Then it's going to bind to a transition the finish launch. Now basically what this means is we're going to transition to black, and then we're going to call the finish launch function. And the finish launch function is going to do a couple things. It's first off going to set the player node to visible so that way the player actually appears. It's going to set the level camera, that's the camera within level 1 scene, .current to false. And what this is going to do is force that camera to no longer be the main camera of the game, which by default is going to make the player node camera the main camera. Then we're going to tween out that transition. So we're going to fade back from black to clear, and we're going to unpause the tree as well as set is playing equal to true. And this should effectively start the game. It's going to make the player visible. It's going to disable the level camera and go ahead and get us started. Now we're not going to delete the level camera because we're actually going to be using it whenever we die. We need to move that level camera to wherever the player is and then delete the player so that way the level camera kind of stays there and the AI just kind of wander around and do their own thing around where the player once was. Next up, there's two more scripts we need to handle, and that's going to be the death functions. The first one is going to be called onDeath, and it's going to be passing in a camera location and a camera rotation. This is going to be wherever the player's last camera rotation and position was. We're first off just going to go ahead and pause the game. We're going to set is playing to false so that way we can't use the pause menu anymore. And we're going to tween in a transition calling a show death menu function after the transition. So it's going to fade to black and then use the show death menu function, which we need to create right here. Now the show death menu function is going to be a little bit more complex than the others. It's going to take in a camera rotation and location as vector 3s as parameters. And then first off, it's going to set the mouse mode to visible. Then it's going to set the death menu to visible. So that's going to be this menu right down here called the restart menu. Then we're going to be setting the level camera.global position equal to the camera location that we've been passed, as well as the global rotation to the rotation we've been passed, and set its current equal to true. Just like we did down here with finish launch, we're going to be doing the opposite right here to force the camera to that location. Then we're going to go ahead and set the player node.queue_free. So that's going to go ahead and delete the player node. And we're going to tween out that transition, fading back from black to clear. And we're going to unpause the game so that way the AI can kind of wander around and do their own thing. Now, everything else will be handled from the restart menu itself, but we do need to go ahead and create a couple functions for handling inputs. And this is going to be the pause menu and the full screen functionality of the launch menu. So toggling pause menu is simple enough. If the function is called, we're just going to check to see if the pause menu is visible. And if so, we're going to hide it. And if not, we're going to show it. And that's going to be called from the input function. The input function is just going to catch every time we press the action escape. So that's every time we hit the escape key and we are currently playing, then go ahead and toggle the pause menu. So that way, every time you hit escape, you just flip between the pause menu. And we do need a function to handle toggling the full screen mode. Now the full screen mode is a little bit more complicated. You have to use something called a display server. Now the display server is kind of a one-stop shop for anything having to do with the window itself. Whenever you're moving around the window of the game, this is how you access that data. We're just going to use the function window get mode, and it will return a enum just saying whether we're full screen or windowed or what have you. And we're just going to check to see if that does not equal full screen, go ahead and set it to full screen. Otherwise, set it to windowed. So every time you press the full screen button, it'll swap back and forth between those two. Now finally, we can go ahead and handle the ready function. Now the ready function is going to handle all of the setup to everything else. First off, we're going to go ahead and pause the game by using the getTree.paused boolean. Then we're going to set the transition material to 3. So this is going to start off as a black screen. We're going to set the launch menu visible to true. So that's going to be that initial launch menu. And we're going to go ahead and execute the tween out transition. So this is going to fade from black back to clear. Next up, we can go ahead and handle the player node.visible equal false. So we can just disable the player node. That way, if the player happens to be inside the field of view of the camera, it just won't be there. And we'll set the level camera.current equal to true. So that'll default to the level camera. Last but not least, we need to go ahead and get the player health controller. Now the player health controller, I did make a couple changes to. And if we go over there, we can see we now have a on player death as well as a player camera reference. Now the on player death is simple enough. It just executes whenever the player dies, and we're passing in the player's camera location and rotation, and then we're not doing anything because everything else is going to be handled with the menu. That's all we need to do to execute the end of the game. Now we do go ahead and reset the damage effect material so that way it doesn't end up being applied at the beginning of the next game. And that's pretty much all we did for the player health control. Hopping back to the menu controller, we do need to go ahead and check to see if the player health controller does not equal null, then we can go ahead and connect to the on player death function. And we're going to be binding the on death function that we just created right here. Now, something to note here. With these parameters, it can be a bit confusing, but basically the gist is if a signal executes with parameters, so on the player health controller, we have the on death signal and it passes a camera location and camera rotation. The first variables in the function that you're binding need to be identical to that. So we're passing in a camera location and camera rotation. If there was another variable here, say we called it test and it was of type Boolean, then we would need to pass in that extra variable here because it's not handled by the actual signal. So we could just say pass false or true, and that would handle the test variable and everything else would be handled by the on player death signal because both of those are being passed by the signal. So it kind of combines the two whenever you execute this signal. So that's something to be aware of. It took me a bit of digging to figure that out, but yeah, that's how it works. And we don't need that Boolean there. So moving on, we can go ahead and save this. We're pretty much done here. We need to set it up, however. So let's drag the menu handler in there. Let's go ahead and assign the launch menu, pause menu, and death menu. And we go ahead and assign the transition material to the menu overlay material, and let's go ahead and leave transition time equal to 2. We can save this, and then we'll be setting the player node and level camera in the actual test scene, but let's go ahead and make sure that all the signals are hooked up. So all of the signals are pretty self-explanatory. We have the toggle full screen function, the begin launch function, as well as the exit game function. And all of these are just connected up to their various functions. And a couple are duplicates. So like the quit button in both of these, the quit button in all of these call the same function, but everything else is pretty self-explanatory. And we can just leave just leave all of that alone. Now let's go ahead and make this let's go ahead and make this menu extend control so that way it's of the right type, and we'll be good to go there. We should be able to go ahead and save this. Let's hop over to the level 1 scene. We can select menus and assign the player node as well as the level camera. And there is one thing I want to go over before we continue. There were a couple changes that I ended up having to make based off of input from the community. And the first one being the direction here. I actually had someone message me on Discord earlier asking about this. Basically the direction, if you don't do it in this manner where you set the direction.y equal to 0 and then normalize it, before that we were just normalizing it right here. This kind of cancels out any vertical movement. So the movement by pointing upwards was resulting in the players not moving as fast if they were looking straight up or straight down. So this kind of counteracts that and resolves that issue. And in addition to that, there was a couple issues with the enemy AI controller having to do with checking if the target was valid. So if the player was deleted, we need to check to see if it's null. And if it's not null, then we need to check to see if the instance is valid. So that means that the player character has been queued free. And if it's queued free, we need to go ahead and set it to null. So we go ahead and resolve that by checking the target is valid at the beginning of every process function. And we also do that in the limb placement controller right here just to verify that. That prevents a lot of errors that were occurring whenever the player actually died. So that should be it. We can go ahead and hop in and see how it looks in game. All right, and it fades in just fine. If we go ahead and toggle full screen, that works just fine. So let's go ahead and hit the play button and see what happens. And it fades out, fades back in, and we're moving around. We can see, we can shoot the enemy. They die, and if we press escape, we can go ahead and pause the game. We've got resume and quit. If we resume, it goes ahead and finishes the animation, kind of an odd flourish. And then if we go ahead and let them kill us, it pauses. And then it resumes with the restart function. And we can now restart or quit, and the AI just kind of wander around. If we restart, we're back on the main screen. and that works out pretty good. So that's where we're going to be leaving it today. Thank you all for your communication, your input, and your patience specifically with this last week. Next week, we're going to be handling the audio as well as kind of just a rundown of the entire project, kind of a post-mortem of just talking about the project, what worked, what didn't work, what I like, and what I'm probably going to be carrying forward, and what I may be leaving behind as we move forward with other projects. Thank you all for watching through this entire project. It's been a wild ride, and it's been a lot of fun, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. We'll see you all back here next week for the last tutorial in the FPS horror series.